Well, today is the first Sunday of Advent, day 1 of the new liturgical year. And so, the very first reading of the very first Mass of the liturgical year, the first Sunday of Advent, has a very famous reading from the prophet Isaiah, which says, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks." Sounds rather nice, doesn't it? It's a nice way to start out the year, thinking about people giving up violence and working for peace, and giving up violence and working for things that improve society. It's a nice thought, beating swords into plowshares. However, and there's always a however, if you were to go back to the time of Isaiah, or for that matter, 100 years ago to any blacksmith shop, and you took a sword and you said, "I'd like this beaten into a plowshare," well, what you'd be asking for is an awful lot of work. How would it go? Well, let's say you had that sword and you came in and you wanted that beaten into a plowshare. Well, the blacksmith would look at it and say, okay. He'd give you a price. It wouldn't be cheap. Then he'd have to fire up his forge and get it super hot, because very hot. You got to melt metal. You have to soften up metal. That's what you have to do to forge something. Soften it. You get it real hot so it's soft. That's not easy. It takes a lot of work to get that going real hot. Then you stick the sword in there till the sword is all red hot. Then you pull it out. Now, in the meantime, the blacksmith has probably put on a leather vest. In the time of Isaiah, it would have been a leather vest and a leather mask. Today they have, glass, plastic masks they wear across the face. Why? Because the work is pounding. You take a big hammer and you pound and you pound and you pound and you pound. And every time you pound, sparks go flying. And hopefully they'll hit the leather vest or the leather mask you're wearing in the time of Isaiah. If not, you get burned. If you ever look at the old paintings of blacksmiths from the Renaissance or times of the past, you'll notice they have a lot of burnt skin and a lot of welts on them. That's from the sparks from doing all the pounding. It's hard work. And one of the risks of being a blacksmith was losing an eye. Because if a big enough spark came out and hit you dead center and you didn't blink in time, you could lose your eye. It's not uncommon for a blacksmith to have to wear a patch. Tough work, hard work to get it done. And so, when we explore the imagery of taking a sword into a plowshare, or taking acts of war and violence and turning into something of peace, we have to begin by the fact that the imagery, if you really understand it, means it's going to take a lot of hard work and you're going to run risks doing it. That's what it's saying. Let me tell you a story about someone I knew who worked very hard to turn swords into plowshares. This would have been the late Bishop of Recife, Brazil, Dom Helder Câmara. When I was a seminarian, I had the opportunity of meeting him, having breakfast with him back in the mid-'80s. He had been appointed Bishop of Recife in the late 60s. He was a friend of what became Pope Paul a man who became Pope Paul VI, so he was made Archbishop of Recife. And at that time, the area around Recife was filled with hundreds of thousands of small farms, 10, 15-acre farms, where farmers were growing beans and rice and corn and all kinds of vegetables. And Brazil was an exporter of food. There's plenty of food. But Brazil, unfortunately, had a military dictatorship. And then came the first oil embargo. If you remember that back in '73. Well, the Brazilian government decided it was going to become self-sufficient in fuel, a beautiful goal. Now these farmers, these hundreds of thousands of farmers in the Recife area, they didn't own their land. They had been leasing their land from wealthy landowners for generations, in some cases for hundreds of years. They just pay the lease in crops, percentage of the crops. Well, the government made a deal with these wealthy landowners to turn all of it into sugar plantations. sugar cane, and all the fuel was going to be made from sugar cane. And that's what they did. In 1 year, all of the leases were canceled, and hundreds of thousands of farmers were displaced from their land. And they poured into Recife looking for work, and there was no work. And they built shacks up and down the sides of these hillsides to live in. And it was in one of these giant slums, Nova Descoberta. The nickname was New Discovery. Probably was a new discovery was how poor it was. That was the discovery. And that's where I lived for a summer with Bob Singleton, who was ministering to all these poor people. Farmers who had no other skills except farming and now were scrambling and trying to find a job, trying to find anything to support their families. It was a tough thing. And it was under these circumstances that the bishop decided that he would confront the government and says, you guys got to do something about these people. You got to help out these people. You can't, because the government, was expanding its army. They were threatening Argentina. There was war talk. They never came to anything, but they were buying armaments. They were worried about a war with Argentina. Didn't happen, thank God. And he said, you can't be spending money on this kind of stuff when you have all these people, barely alive here in these hills around the city. Well, that did not set too well with the generals. So they thought this bishop, the problem was the bishop was talking too much and complaining too much. So they sent a goon squad out to gun him down. They came to this little back sacristy where he lived in this 4-room apartment, and they gunned everything, the windows and the walls. The bishop wasn't there at the time, but his assistant was, so his assistant was killed. Now eventually, the junta, gave up power, they had elections, things got a little bit better. And I was there when the bishop was still living there, and I remember going there in the morning and sitting down with him for breakfast, and I remember seeing all the bullet holes. He never patched those bullet holes up. He wanted everyone to see what had happened to him, and that this is what happens when you actually try to beat a sword into a plowshare. People don't want to give up those swords, all right? Just letting you know. So it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to do. He tried his best. He tried his best. That's all I can say. So that's one level. That's one level of beating swords into plowshares. Another way of beating swords into plowshares is looking at our own actions. What makes us upset? What makes us angry? Are we capable of violent acts? There's many levels of peace. There's peace between nations, there's peace within nations, and there's peace within families, and there's peace within our own mind. And you can look at it from the standpoint of your own mind and figure out what makes me angry and what can I do to stop it? What can I put into practice? What habits can I take to keep me from blowing up, to keep me from getting angry, from keeping me from losing it and yelling? And just like it's hard to take a real sword into a plowshare, and just as it's hard to get a government to worry more about its people than its power, it's just as hard to change your own life. Beating swords into plowshares is tough. It's tough. But with the grace of God and perseverance, it can be achieved. So as we begin this Lenten season with the very first reading, it's a challenge for all of us to take stock in our lives and to see about violence and what we can do about it and how we can prevent it and how we can change it into a plowshare, symbolizing a betterment of ourselves and the people around us.